Okay, this is TEAS Mock Science version 4, and I'm going to make this as fast as I possibly can because I kind of intend Mock 4 and Mock 5 to be reasonably kind of thought of as together. So by now, you're probably getting to the point where you've kind of rounded out your thought processes and your reasoning processes, and hopefully you feel like you're getting pretty adapted to identifying things that are wrong or that are supposed to trick you in terms of answer choices or the little tricks that are built into the questions. So I won't go into tons of detail. I will definitely reference which class for every single one of these questions. If there is something that's totally worth explaining, I will, but my main intent is to have you get through this video pretty quickly. The one thing I will point out, most likely, although things always change with how I do my recommendations in the program, most likely you've taken mock 1, 2, and 3. So you've gotten used to this is what the test looks like. This is what I could expect to score on the test. And most likely now you're working to improve beyond probably a lot of improvement that you've already done. And you're looking to get a little bit further in your thought processes, but you do have them. So the way that I wrote this test is a little bit more, I guess it's a tiny bit less formatted like the TEAS, although in most ways it still looks exactly like the TEAS. But I made some of the questions a bit harder. I utilized a lot of like 2 blank and 3 blank questions where you have to fill in multiple things. And in writing those, I've noticed that having 2 blanks that you've got to fill in can make it harder, but it can also make it easier because it can kind of disqualify an answer that otherwise might seem pretty good because you figure out one of the blanks is definitely wrong. So those kind of balance out. The reason that I put them in here is so that you can really focus into developing your thought processes and your organization processes. The more you're trying to deal with and keep together at once when you're in a particular question, the better you stretch your thought processes. So I'm not necessarily as focused with this particular version on what you score as I am on what your thought processes are. So you should score well and hopefully do score well because those are rounded out. But some of these questions, I made them a little bit more difficult to navigate than the same question actually would be on the TEAS. So if you miss some of this, that's okay. But what we want to identify is where in your thought processes are you losing pieces? What are you not noticing that's either in front of you in the question or hidden into one of the answers? So that would be my ask, is that we really focus on how the thought processes worked. In this case, one thing that I will mention, if you did feel like you had trouble with the questions that have 2 blanks or 3 blanks, there was a recommendation that I made earlier when I did a mock version for the HESI, and now I'm doing the one for the TEAS, that you should always on a 2 blank question, and there actually are quite a few of those on the real TEAS, just not as many as what you're going to see right here. You should always pick the blank that you know the most about. So you might read a question that's got 2 different blanks that you've got to fill in, and one of the blanks you might feel almost clueless to, or maybe just not super savvy in, but the other blank you might be like, oh, I know everything about filling in this blank. So you should always start with the blank that's going to be the easiest for you to fill in accurately, and then do the other blank, because you'll find a lot of the time, like I said a minute ago, they can actually end up easier because there was 2 blanks, because you might, if you can get 1 blank filled in for sure, there might not be a contest anymore on the other one, because you may know that the second blank has to be this, and then your only option is one particular thing. So if you did have trouble with that as you went through, my suggestion would be to pause before you go on through this with me, in order to go back and look at those 2 blank questions again and really focus on picking one of the blanks to focus on first. That's the one you feel more qualified to answer accurately, and then zip back to the blank that you are less qualified in. I'll show you an example of that. So if when we get to the first example of that, if me showing you makes you go, oh, I see how that could have benefited me, you'll also be able to pause at that point and go back and do that. So if you think you've developed a thought process from what I suggest here that you weren't using, I would definitely, as soon as you detect that, I would pause and go try to use that thought process so that you get the most out of it before you hear the answers to this test. I'll point that out again in just a second because number 5 is going to be the first example of that. Question 1 is going to be from Bio 1. Which of the following states of matter will fill any container regardless of its size? You've seen this question in several different formats. This is just worded like you haven't seen it worded before. The only state of matter that we can say fills 2 different sized containers without having a different amount of it would be gas. And that's because the molecules in a gas spread themselves out. So they theoretically, in a theoretical sense, they fill a container because they spread out and take up all the space. Question 2 is from Anatomy 1, an autoimmune disease characterized by inflammation of the joints. You'll notice as I go through here, and you've probably noticed and heard me talk about it in the other mocks, you should always read a question all the way through just in one fell swoop, but you should also come back and just kind of read it and pull out the key words. So the words that I'm underlining as we're going along are the words that should have stood out to you to where you, for example, on number 2, you would read it, you would say an autoimmune disease characterized by inflammation in the joints is, and then you'd read it again and you'd say autoimmune, inflammation, joints, because that's what you're actually answering. So we need it to be autoimmune, we need inflammation to be the issue, and we need it in the joints. For me, I can cross A and B out right away because of joints. So if it's joints, I know it's arthritis. The autoimmune part of it is what tells me that it's rheumatoid, so it's going to be C as opposed to D. 3 is what is the function of a neuron? That's from Anatomy 2. You've answered this question 1,000 times. I hopefully am still writing it just a little bit differently each time as far as the answers. In this case, it's going to be A, because B and C both specify half of the system, which is the one big no-no when you're answering that question, is you do not want to end up specifying the one half of the system or the other, the motor or the sensory. So the only one that doesn't but still has an accurate field of view would be A, generating action potentials. Which of the following adds to the mass of an atom? This is from Biology 2, where we talk about the parts of an atom. So adds to the mass of an atom is going to be D, because both protons and neutrons have an influence on mass. You got that one right if you read all the answer choices. If you didn't, then you might have picked something before you actually got to this option that's more inclusive. Of course, we always want the most inclusive answer if possible, and we always want the most specific answer if possible. Some instances, they won't give you the absolute best answer. They'll give you a little bit of a step down from it, and that's the best that you get. In this case, they gave us the ultimate answer choice. Had they not given that, having them together like that as an option, then they would have given just one of them. So maybe you would see protons as a possibility, or maybe you'd see neutrons, and then that's where you could end up picking just one of them. If they give you the ability to put them together, then that's what you want to do. The blank of the neuron is responsible for interacting with the environment, while the blank is responsible for insulation. So this is one of those 2 parts. This one is from Anatomy 2. So on this one, insulation stood out to me very quickly. So the second blank to me seems like I might be able to be more accurate with it maybe than the first one. So myelin sheath is what we associate with the word insulation in talking about neurons, or neural channels as they referred to it this time. Myelin sheath only exists in one of the answer choices. So all I really need to do now is just go back to that first blank and make sure that dendrites does make sense there. So the blank of the neuron is responsible for interacting with the environment. That is what dendrites do. So because the second blank was so easy for me, the first blank was handled. That's what I'm referring to in that two-step strategy. So if that is not how you did it, and if you think that would have changed how difficult some of them were for you to answer, you might want to pause and try that and see if it affects your answers, see if it affects your confidence, and then come back to get the answers when you've got your best foot forward as far as answering those questions. 6 is from Anatomy 2 also because it's endocrine. The blank maintains primary control over the endocrine system by interacting with the nervous system. That's a lot of information. I know for a fact that the primary control of endocrine is the hypothalamus. And I also know that the one gland who can actually understand the language of the nervous system is also the hypothalamus. Again, there's only one option that actually has that in the first blank. So now instead of having to really focus on this question, I just need to go to the second blank and I need to see if I plug pituitary in there, is that going to work? Because if so, then we know that it's A. The pituitary gland maintains the second highest level of endocrine control and carries messages from that primary control gland. Again, both of those are totally true. The pituitary is the second in command, and it takes messages from the hypothalamus. So that is A. And again, it was very, very easy for me to answer just because one of the two blanks was easy for me to answer. 7 is also from Anatomy 2. Which hormone would activate in response to lower than optimal blood calcium? So it's obviously the trick of this is remembering. Hopefully you remember that there's 2 of them that do one thing, and then there's 1 of them that do the other thing. Remembering which one is which with the ones that have the calci is kind of difficult. There are 2 hormones that respond to lower than optimal. There's 1 hormone that responds to higher than optimal. The one that responds to higher is what they have parked in choice B, calcitonin. And then PTH is in response to low levels, as is calcitrol. And that's why you didn't see calcitrol there as a choice, is because there wouldn't be a way to pick between PTH and calcitrol. 8 is Anatomy 3, reproductive system. The primary function of blank is to promote maturation of eggs, while the primary function of blank is to ready the uterus for pregnancy. By now, hopefully you remember that estrogen does maturing of eggs, and progesterone, P for pro, P for pregnancy, progesterone does pregnancy. So that is C. Puts estrogen in that first blank, progesterone in the second. 9 is Anatomy 2, coming from endocrine system. ADH is originally released by the blank, and its primary action site is the blank system. The second of the 2 blanks stands out as the easiest one to me because ADH is antidiuretic hormone. That is most definitely going to involve the kidneys, the urinary system. So I know that I want to put urinary in that second blank. That gives me 2 choices left. So it doesn't answer it for me, but it gets me halfway there. So the question is, does ADH originally come from the pituitary, or does it originally come from the hypothalamus? And the answer to that is it's one of the 2 hormones that comes originally from the hypothalamus. So that would be B. 10 says, what tissue type is involved in generating movement? That is from Anatomy 1. And that is always going to be muscle. Muscle cells, muscle tissue, and muscles. Anything that involves the word muscle, that is the only thing that can actually produce or generate movement. No other tissue or cell type can do that. 11 is from Anatomy 2. Yeah, Anatomy 2 with the muscular system. A scientist observes a tissue sample under a microscope. He observes multiple nuclei and a large number of mitochondria in each cell. The multiple nuclei is there just to sort of kind of throw you off, because I know we've talked about the mitochondria part quite a bit in your muscular notes, and mentioned briefly when we went through the picture diagram in class, though, I do mention that there's also multiple nuclei. So multiple nuclei would, if you actually put something under the microscope and you noted that there were a lot of nuclei, that would eliminate certain cell types from being in the running for what you're looking at, but it would not take you all the way down to just being able to identify one cell type. So there's a few different types of cells that have multiple nuclei, two of the big ones being muscle cells and nervous cells. So that doesn't completely make it exclusive. The large number of mitochondria, we only see that with muscle. So everything that starts with an M has to do with muscle. Muscle has a lot of mitochondria and it generates movement. All of those start with M. So this is actually what should have made you certain that it's muscle tissue. This is also true of muscle tissue, but it was sort of extra in the question because you had one thing that trumped the other one in a sense. 12 is anatomy 4. I also mentioned this in anatomy 3, and I'll mention how it comes from both classes in a second. Which of the following processes is responsible for gas exchange between the cardiovascular and respiratory? If you think about where the cardiovascular interacts with the respiratory system, what moment in time we see them together, that would be like at the alveoli. The two systems are truly seriously interacting in their purest form at the alveoli, which is the site of actual original gas exchange. That's where we're bringing in oxygen and we're trading it out for the CO2, and the true exchange is happening. That happens by diffusion. So does pretty much anything that they could ask you. How does the chemical process happen? If it's something your body does, so the kidneys with filtration also use diffusion. So gas exchange is a diffusion process. Filtering the blood in the kidneys is a diffusion process. Digestive absorption, how our nutrients actually make it into our bloodstream, that also uses diffusion. So diffusion is a very good bet as to what the way that certain things exchange would be. So the way that oxygen comes on to the blood and the way that CO2 at the same time leaves the blood is using just passive transport diffusion. Remember that diffusion is a type of passive transport. It doesn't require energy. It's a natural movement. Osmosis is not an appropriate answer because osmosis refers to a situation where we're trying to make the particle numbers exactly identical in two different places. In the case of something like gas exchange, that is not a perfect science. It's not a perfect exchange. Nothing that you're really going to answer on the TEAS, honestly, to totally cut to the chase, is going to be osmosis. You're not going to have a reason on the TEAS to say osmosis. You're not going to have a reason to say carrier mediated, and you're not going to have a reason to say active unless they define one of those and you're certain that it's the definition of that. I have not seen that happen. All I've seen them use is things that relate to diffusion. So if you see these answer choices, unless it's a particular extenuating circumstance, you are most likely going to pick diffusion, especially if it relates to us and our physiology. We use diffusion for most of the processes that they'll mention. Hydrogen bonds are an example of what and they hold what together, comes from Bio 1. Hydrogen bonds are inter. Hopefully you immediately eliminated A and B. And then they hold molecules together. The second part of this question is a little different than the way I've shown it to you in the past, just to stretch your thought process. But by now you know that intermolecular forces hold an entire molecule to an entire other molecule. And that is saying the same thing as saying holding molecules together, as opposed to atoms, because that would be intramolecular. 14 is from Anatomy 1. Epithelial tissue is classified by what two things? That is going to be choice B. The number of layers and the shape of the cells that are in the layer are the two things that allow us to name epithelial tissue more specifically. 15 is from Anatomy 1 also. Pseudophorus glands are blank and responsible for releasing blank. They are exocrine because the thing that they are releasing is leaving the body as opposed to just releasing into another part of the body. So exocrine means that it's leaving. So sweat is definitely something that is leaving. And then it's responsible for sweat because it's pseudophorus, not sebaceous. Choice B is very close. If you glanced wrong, you might mix them up, but sebaceous would be the exocrine that do sebum. Pseudophorus, which is the one that was the subject of this, is exocrine that does sweat. 16 also from Anatomy 1, the hypodermis is made of, in this case, they gave you the most specific possible answer choice. So that's the one that you want to pick, which is going to be adipose. 17, what is the primary protein of epithelial tissue? And then as the second part of the question, the primary protein of connective tissue. So epithelial is keratin. Connective is collagen, so that is choice C. 18 is from Anatomy 4. White blood cells are made where and matured where? And then there's another sentence that says T cells are both made and matured where? Your correct answer to this one would be B. White blood cells, lymphocytes, are made in the yellow bone marrow. However, they travel to the thymus where they mature. And then T cells are named T cells because they are made and matured in the thymus. So your second two answers are both thymus. Your first answer is yellow marrow. Again, you could have done that in any order depending on how the blanks stood out to you. 19, osteo what are responsible for dissolving bone, and osteo what are mature bone cells. That is from Anatomy 1. Again, you could go in either order. I think I did this one with the mature bone cells first because I know that that's sites. In this particular case, that didn't help me out too much. It only got rid of one choice for me, but it's a start. So then I need to decide what's responsible for dissolving bone, and that would be the clasts. The sheath lining the outside of bones is called it looks like I put all of our Anatomy 1 questions together just to make it a little easier for review, I guess. So there's a key word in this, which is the sheath lining the outside of bones. I guess that's a key phrase because you have two answers here that have to do with what you would describe as being the outermost part of the bone. The epiphysis refers to structurally like the end of a bone. So it has that epi prefix, which both epi and peri actually mean the same thing. They mean outward. In the case of the periosteum, that means the superficial part of the bone, the furthest out from the center of the bone. And that's the one that is a sheath that lines the bone. And epiphysis is a structural landmark. So it does mean outward. So outside of bones would connect to both of those terms. But sheath lining is what tells us that what we're looking for is the first one. 21 is from Anatomy 1 as well. I swear this whole test is not Anatomy 1, but we did put them all together here. What joints are prone to dislocation because of their structure? That is ball and socket, the hips and the shoulders. Which of the following describes the role of muscles in conjunction with the nervous system? So that is from Anatomy 2. That's a tricky question, but when you go to read your answers, hopefully that clarifies kind of what they're asking. So muscles are very much involved with the actions of the nervous system, but they are not nervous cells or tissues. So essentially the question is, how do they relate to each other? And the answer to that would be A, that muscles are the effectors. that produce movement. And even if you didn't remember what an effector is, and even if you didn't remember how muscles interact with the nervous system, produce movement, we know is muscle. So muscle is required to produce movement, which means that even though the nervous system can do all kinds of communicating, it can't produce movement. It needs muscles to be able to do that. So in order to respond to something that is happening in our internal or external environment, we need to produce movement. That is what the role is of muscles. So in response to nervous signals, the muscles will produce movement, and that makes them effectors. What is the function of the nuclear pore in eukaryotic cells? That is from Biology 1. This is something that we don't emphasize a whole lot in the first lecture, but it gets emphasized in the review lectures because it's kind of a newer thing. The nuclear pore is the little holes. If you look really close at the nucleus, it's actually dotted kind of like this. Those nuclear pores are the passages that RNA uses to go in and out to complete transcription. DNA does not leave the nucleus. So B might have been tempting because it's always tempting when there's an answer that looks very similar to another answer, but it's more inclusive. In this case, we do not want the more inclusive one because DNA would never pass through that pore. Only RNA goes in and out. What is the location of integration in the nervous system is anatomy 2. And integration is a very specific word that describes the moment in time where a sensory signal is understood and a motor response is sent back out. And that happens, that integration where the two are combined happens in the brain. Also from anatomy 2, what are the two primary divisions of the nervous system? In this case, because it totally depends on your choices, you're going to say motor and sensory. All of the other ones are mismatched as far as pairs. So don't forget that motor and sensory is one of the possibilities alongside like central and peripheral, except we don't have those paired. Sensory, somatic, and autonomic. And then parasympathetic and sympathetic. But in this case, all of them that we had given to us were listed in incorrect pairs, except that first one. Which of the following lists of, hold on. There we go. Which of the following lists of characteristics aligns with sympathetic nervous system activation? So this, as well as one that's coming up 2 questions from now, are kind of those trickier ones where they try to put the systems together. So the list of characteristics for sympathetic activation are what you would find in your notes under like the properties of sympathetic or the things that happen with sympathetic. Don't forget the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline is not only part of this, it's a huge part of it. It's actually what causes all the other things that happen. So when adrenaline and noradrenaline gets released, it increases heart rate, it increases blood pressure, and it constricts pupils as well as everything else that's characteristic of this nervous system. So this one is all of the above. That does come from anatomy 2. Which system is these 3, 26, 27, and 28 go together? Which system is the primary action site of epinephrine? There are multiple action sites for epinephrine, which is why they say primary. This question above actually gives you a bit of a hint because it reminds you that a lot of the characteristics we describe have to do with the cardiovascular system. So adrenaline has the most effect. Adrenaline and epinephrine are the same thing on the cardiovascular system. So a lot of the effects that we see have something to do with that system. That is from anatomy 2, endocrine. And then the 28 also goes along those same lines. Which of the following enzymes is most active during parasympathetic activation. This question gets discussed in Anatomy 3 with the digestive system, and it also gets talked about a little bit in Anatomy 2. This is very important. I still see a lot of people get really nervous when they see this type of question, but you should completely have the answer to this if you've mastered Anatomy 2 and Anatomy 3, because parasympathetic is our rest and digest system. Parasympathetic doesn't have like its own hormone. So the sympathetic, it's very easy to call out a hormone for sympathetic because it's adrenaline or noradrenaline. The parasympathetic doesn't have that, which is probably why people tend to get a little freaked out and struggle with this. There's not a hormone you're supposed to list because it's in your notes next to that. What they're referencing is if this system is active, it's because we're resting and most likely digesting food. So you're going to look at digestive enzymes, because when would a digestive enzyme be at its most active? During parasympathetic, because parasympathetic focuses on digestive system, puts all of its resources to digestive system, and in turn, your digestive system is most active when the para system is active. The only thing else other than that I would point out on this is this does not say lipase, it says ligase. So you always have to be very careful. Anytime it seems like there's two right answers, obviously there isn't. So usually it's something like that where they'll use something that looks quite similar to something, and it's not the same. 29, in muscle, actin is the blank. I believe we have 4 total blanks here. So you're finding out, is actin the thin or thick filament? What kind of functions does it do? Same thing for myosin. Is it the thick or the thin filament? And what does it do? Ultimately, your answer should be A. So actin is thin and does support. Myosin is thick and produces the force for the contraction. That is from Anatomy 2 under muscular system. Which of the following best describes the interaction of actin and myosin? I've talked about this a few times. This is probably not the first time you've heard this. When they ask you for interaction, what's crucial is that you don't answer in a way that's like, well, actin does this and myosin does that. They're asking you what their interaction is, and they're not going to fill in the blanks based on what you say. A standardized test can't infer something from what you describe. So it would not work to say, oh, well, actin provides support and myosin generates force. That's what choice A says. What's wrong with that is that does not provide an interaction. It provides a description of each of them, which is not the same thing. The one that provides the interaction is D. This is the only one that accurately says, here's what they do together with one another. A is accurate. It's just not the answer to the question. B and C are inaccurate. And then D is accurate and does answer the question. Which of the following is the contracting unit of muscle? Again, by now you're probably getting very, very good at recognizing these terms. When they say unit, that's the sarcomere, which is made up of myosin and actin and a couple of other things. So again, if it's contracting unit, that's the only word we can use. It is not the same thing to say myosin and actin. That does not make it a sarcomere just because you have those two things. Renin is released from where? Travels through the bloodstream and goes to its primary action site, which is where? So renin is released from the kidneys, and that actually in this case will answer our question because there's only one choice that has that blank correct. Its primary action site is the cardiovascular system. Renin is the one that helps control blood pressure in response to what the kidneys are doing. And that is from Anatomy 3, along with urinary system is where that's talked about. 33 is the blood flow order through the nephron. You've answered this 100 times, and that is C. proximal, loop, distal, and collecting. That is from Anatomy 3 also. I basically just made this test into perfect order for the classes, which is not necessarily a bad thing now that I think about it. Let's see, 34 is what gland is responsible for communication between endocrine and nervous, and then also because of that has control over the other glands in the endocrine. That is hypothalamus. You answered something very similar to this earlier in the test, and it actually said this thing about communication between those systems. So if you remember running into that, that actually answers that next follow-up question for you. 35, the blank has the second highest level of control over the endocrine. That's going to be pituitary. Anatomy 2 again. This mock focuses into a little bit of biology, anatomy 1, 2, and a little bit of 3. The other mock focuses a bit more on 3 and 4, so they're kind of meant to be almost complementary in a sense. They are the right length. They are the length of the real test, so you will score this as normal, but you'll see more 3 and 4 coming from the other. Mock 5 is the other one. 36 is a reproductive question, so anatomy 3. And it's asking where fertilization occurs, and then therefore that's the location where what process begins. So hopefully when you hear fertilization, you immediately know it's fallopian tubes. So that brings you to A and B. And then it's meiosis that is involved with reproduction, not mitosis. Mitosis would be stem cells. Meiosis would be reproductive. The way I always remember meiosis is the one that's reproductive, is that reproductive is RE and meiosis is ME. And even further than that, fertilization is FE. So those words match up at the beginning. Mitosis would be stem cells. Stem has a T as its second letter as well. 37 is anatomy 3. It crosses both the urinary system and the reproductive system. Which two systems share what is basically the question. So reproductive and urinary, that gets D out of the running, but leaves us with 3 choices still. And then what tube do the systems share? And it actually didn't say tube here, but you probably filled that in with your thought processes and what you know. They don't have to say tube. There's only one structure, period, that's shared between reproductive and urinary systems, which is a tube, and it's the urethra. The ureters are just part of urinary. The bulbourethral gland is just part of the reproductive system. 38 is anatomy 2, about endocrine. Testosterone is responsible for. In this case, B is the best answer because it's got everything. It would be, depending on the situation, sperm production would be a very accurate thing to say testosterone is responsible for. In this case, we had the opportunity to say not only sperm production, but hunger responses, and that's the ultimate scenario. You would not want to answer just hunger responses, because when you have just one answer instead of all the right info, you want to think about primary. So the primary is sperm production. The reason testosterone exists in the first place is sperm production. When they have both available and you've got not only your primary that has to be there, but also the other possible answer, that's the one that you're going to go with. 39 is from General Science 1. What is a prediction or educated guess about the result of an experiment? That would be A, hypothesis. 40 is also General Science 1. A scientist studies the impact of a certain medication on cancer. What is the dependent variable? The dependent variable is the one that we measure and look for a change in. So in this case, that would be the cancer. The medication is what would be independent. So we purposely change the presence of or lack of the medication, and then we look at what the cancer is doing. Which glands release chemicals responsible for breakdown of starch molecules? I've had this question from a couple of students recently. This is Anatomy 3. I guess the point that I want to make in putting this question in here is don't forget that starch is another way of saying carbohydrate. It's one of the specific types of carbohydrates out of the 3 or 4 possible types. So carbohydrates are sugar molecules. Same with starch. Starch is complex sugar. This question actually has a lot going on with it. So when you think of carbohydrates and starch, your first thought might be amylase. That was what my first thought was. They are asking about amylase. The problem is they're asking which glands release the chemicals that are responsible for that. The chemical would be amylase. That would be the enzyme. The gland that releases amylase that they have listed here is salivary glands. Salivary are not the only glands that release amylase, but they will never put 2 choices there at the same time that would both be possible. So you'll almost always see salivary when you're trying to talk about amylase. When food is being digested, the liver's primary responsibility is the emulsification of fats. That is a specific word that they typically use on TEAS when they're talking about the liver. You could say breakdown of fats, digestion of fats, but emulsification is like the word that is most technically correct for that. What is the primary effect of emphysema? This is from Anatomy 4. The best choice here is B because it's decreased absorption of O2 and CO2. Emphysema affects the alveoli. Alveoli do gas exchange. The reason they call it gas exchange is O2 swaps spots with CO2 and we make an even exchange, an O2 for a CO2. So if emphysema is affecting the alveoli, that is not just going to affect oxygen, although it's tempting to think of oxygen because we always talk about oxygen. Our body does not see getting oxygen in as being any more important than getting CO2 out. In fact, if you look at the way our body reads for homeostasis mechanisms, our body actually seems to think that high CO2 is worse than having low O2. The point that I'm making is it would never be okay to just say, oh, emphysema causes decreased absorption of O2 if you have the option to say both. If you don't, there's no other good option and they do have one that's by itself, then it might be arguable that that's the best answer in that scenario. You always want to look for O2 and CO2 in anything that relates to gas exchange. That will always be your most correct answer. If the alveoli are having an issue, it's going to affect their ability to bind both of those molecules in the same manner. What is the primary purpose of the systemic circuit of the heart is from Anatomy 4. And that would be A, to deliver oxygen to and pick up CO2 from the tissues of the body. Very similar protocol there to what I said on the question right before. If it's possible to get both of these ends of the process in there, that's ultimate. The reason that it's not B, to bring in oxygen and rid the body of CO2 is how we would describe the respiratory system's job. Systemic circuit of the heart, that is the delivery of the oxygen to the tissues and in turn picking up CO2 from those same tissues. Delivery is the key to the systemic circuit. So if you think too broadly, if you think too quickly, you might think, oh, oxygen, CO2, what's the difference between oxygen and CO2 there versus here? The difference is deliver or bring in. Bringing in oxygen and bringing out CO2 is the respiratory system. Delivering oxygen, binding it into the blood and taking it somewhere, that's the cardiovascular system. Delivering oxygen to the tissue of the heart is the coronary circuit. So that is close, but that has its own name, and that's why we can't answer that there. And then maintaining blood pressure is part of the existence of the systemic circuit, but it's not what its job is. Which of the following is an example of natural passive immunity. My recommendation in Anatomy 4 is to think of each term. So you have active and passive, and that refers to whether you have antigens or antibodies that you're talking about. And then you have natural and artificial, and you always want to pull it apart and look for which part of each pair you have. Natural, passive. So passive means antibodies go directly in. That totally skips the entire active process of making an antibody. So if it's active, it makes an antibody. If it's passive, it receives an antibody from somewhere else that somebody else already made. Natural is going to mean exactly what it sounds like, natural. So breastfeeding is where you would receive already pre-made antibodies without scientific intervention. Very close to this would have been artificial passive. They're all close, and all of these answers relate to one of the possible types of immunity. Artificial passive would be an immune serum. Fighting an infection and gaining immunity would be natural active. Vaccination would be artificial active. They will stick to those examples. I gave those examples in class, so you don't have to pack them in here if you already know them. But that's a reminder that usually they will give you 4 answers that are possible for the different types of immunity. So you want to be really careful that you're looking for each of your pairs of words to make sure you don't mix anything up. 46 is from General Science 1. Which of these steps should be taken first? Research what type of information is available on the subject of your upcoming experiment. That is the first thing you do. That comes before a hypothesis. It comes before setting anything up, because your hypothesis is supposed to be an educated guess about what the outcome will be. And you get that educated guess by having some type of knowledge of what it is you're looking at, possibly from what other people have studied, what type of information might already be out there about it. So very, very first is always something to do with researching. And that can come in a lot of different forms. It could say, like, you go to the store and you read the ingredient labels on different possible fertilizers that you can buy. That doesn't sound like research, but ultimately that would be research, just like research is. So you're looking for something that says go out there and figure out what already exists on the subject first, then add your new stuff to it. A scientist performs an experiment to find out how many days a person can survive on soup before getting sick. What is the independent variable? Also General Science 1. So the independent variable, remember, is the thing that we change on purpose. And then the dependent is the thing that we measure as a result of the independent being changed. What we're going to purposely mess with is the number of days that these people eat soup. What we're going to measure, so the dependent variable, is the onset of illness. So what we're looking for in measurement is when the illness comes on. That would be your dependent. So this test was based a lot on thought processes, kind of rewording a lot of the things that you've seen a couple of times by now into a slightly more varied word choice. So in that sense, mock 1, 2, and 3 will be the most like the wording of the test, because by the time you get to 4 and 5, I'm asking it in a slightly harder way and a slightly less direct, less tease oriented way, because otherwise I would just keep repeating the same questions. There's not that many where there's 5 different versions. So this test was harder. You should score a little bit lower on this than what you would on the others, because you had to go a little further out of your way to get the right answers on some of these. But ultimately, we just want to see that your thought processes are right, that you're recognizing a question, you know what class it came from, you know whatever information you're supposed to have, and you can integrate an answer quickly. So let me know how this goes, what your score is. This is accurate in terms of the number of questions so that it will score accurately. But don't forget, when you're doing all this final mock testing, to let me know your 4 scores together for all 4 subjects so that I can do them with a weight, because they need to be weighted in order for the mock to predict your score accurately. That is it for mock 4. I will see you guys later.